The Eternal Polis had always seemed indestructible, its sapphire walls gleaming beneath the sun like divine armor forged by the gods themselves, and for centuries its people believed no enemy could ever breach it, no threat could rattle the marble foundations laid by kings long turned to dust. Yet on the morning the omen rose above the city, even the proudest citizens felt a tremor of fear slithering beneath their skin. The sky was streaked with crimson, a rare and unsettling hue that spread slowly across the horizon like a wound opening in the heavens, and as the city stirred awake, the great bronze gates of the polis groaned under a cold wind that should not have existed in the warm season. Lysandros, captain of the skyward guardians, stood upon the highest battlement overlooking the vast expanse of plains stretching endlessly to the east, his cloak snapping behind him as he studied the strange clouds that moved in formation far too precise to be natural. He was a man carved by war, broad-shouldered, bronze-skinned, with scars slicing across his arms and a calm gaze that had stared down the worst of humanity and lived to tell the tales. Yet as he watched the horizon darken, his breath tightened. He had felt this once before, 15 years ago, on a battlefield long forgotten by most, where an enemy carried banners of onyx and gold and marched without sound. The memory forced itself upon him now, an empire swallowed by silent legions, kings kneeling before shadows that moved with purpose. Lysandros clenched the railing. The carrion horde was returning. Behind him, the polis awoke with its usual grace. Market stalls opening, merchants shouting greetings, temple bells chiming as priestesses burned fragrant herbs to greet Helios at dawn. The Eternal Polis was a jewel of the world, its towers inlaid with silver, its canals reflecting the morning light, and its people boasting of their divine founders. No city matched its libraries, its academies, its courts of law, nor the mighty colonnade of kings where statues of past rulers stood watching over the grand plaza. With 3 concentric walls and an elite guard rumored to be blessed by ancient gods, the city had never fallen to siege. Its people believed it never would. That arrogance was both its strength and its curse. Lysandros descended the stairs 2 at a time, heading toward the inner citadel where the Council of Archons convened. Smoke from early cooking fires curled through the air, mingling with laughter from children chasing each other along the marble steps. A vendor called out to him, offering warm bread with olives. Lysandros raised a hand but did not break stride. The urgency in his steps did not go unnoticed. Citizens paused, frowning as they saw a warrior of such rank moving with such haste. A few whispered. Rumors sprouted like weeds. By the time Lysandros pushed open the bronze doors of the council hall, 11 of the 12 archons were already seated in their semicircular chamber, draped in robes of indigo and white. Sunlight filtered in from the oculus, forming a perfect circle of light on the mosaic floor depicting the founding of the polis, when the first kings raised its sapphire walls with labor and prayer. Archon Thales, an elderly scholar with silver hair braided into coils, lifted his head as Lysandros entered. His voice was gentle but firm. "Captain Lysandros, your message was urgent. Speak." Lysandros bowed with the respect the seat demanded, then straightened. "The sky to the east has reddened. A strange formation approaches, one I recognize." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Archon Seraphel, tall and proud with eagle-sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Recognize? From where?" Lysandros swallowed. "From the Basilean plains. 15 years ago. Before the last empire fell." Silence filled the hall, heavy, oppressive. Everyone knew of the Basilean collapse, though few spoke of it. An entire civilization erased in a single season. Refugees had whispered of silent soldiers with armor black as obsidian, moving like one mind. Scholars dismissed the tales as exaggerations. Lysandros had lived it. "The carrion horde," he said. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Seraphel scoffed. "Impossible. They were rumors. Children's tales." Lysandros's expression did not waver. "I saw their banners. I saw their weapons. I saw an entire army vanish without a scream. And what moves toward us now is the same." Thales leaned back, fingertips pressed together. "How many?" Lysandros hesitated. "Thousands. Tens of thousands. An army blackening the horizon." Gasps erupted. One archon stood abruptly, knocking over his ceremonial staff. "We must send emissaries, offer terms." Lysandros shook his head sharply. "The Carrion do not negotiate. They do not want gold, allies, or land. They want obedience." His gaze hardened. "And when they don't receive it, they erase the disobedient from history." The archon who had risen sank slowly back into his seat, face pale. Seraphel, determined to appear composed, asked, "What of their leader?" "The stories speak of a warlord. A shadow draped in living armor. A man who cannot die." Lysandros's jaw tightened. "He exists. And he commands them still. I saw him on the plains. And I believe he comes for the Eternal Polis." The room erupted with voices, panic, disbelief, frantic argument, until Thales raised his hand for silence. His voice trembled for the first time. "If what you say is true, then the Eternal Polis faces its greatest test since its founding." A low rumble shook the chamber, subtle at first, then stronger. Dust drifted from the oculus. The archons glanced upward in alarm. Lysandros turned sharply toward the doors. "They have reached our outer defenses," he said. "We must prepare at once." He was already sprinting out of the hall before they could respond. Outside, chaos spread through the streets as bronze horns blared from the battlements, a deep, resonant sound that had not rung in a century. Panic rippled through the markets. Mothers gathered their children. Merchants shuttered their stalls. Soldiers took their positions with trembling hands. The sapphire walls gleamed under the rising sun, their enchanted sheen giving an illusion of absolute safety. But Lysandros knew walls alone would not be enough. On the eastern battlement, he joined the skyward guardians, elite warriors clad in gold-steel armor, helmets shaped like sweeping wings. Their commander, a Jackson, bowed stiffly. "Captain." "Scouts report movement beyond the orchards." Lysandros nodded and climbed into a watchtower. What he saw made his blood freeze. The field beyond the orchards was covered in a shadow, a moving carpet of black armor and dark banners marked by a single golden sigil, a serpent devouring its own tail. Thousands of soldiers marched in perfect silence, their steps synchronized, forming flawless squares of infantry. They carried no torches, yet their armor glinted coldly as if lit from within. And at the center of the formation rode a figure on a massive onyx stallion. Tall, broad, draped in armor that seemed alive, shifting with faint pulses of gold. The warlord of Carrion. The devourer of kingdoms. The butcher of the Basilian plains. Lysandros gripped the stone parapet until his knuckles whitened. He whispered, "He's come." The army stopped precisely 1 mile from the outer wall. Then a single horn sounded, not from the polis, but from the invaders. It was a low, resonant note that made the sapphire walls vibrate. The sound clawed at the nerves of every citizen. Some soldiers clutched their ears. Others fell to their knees. The warlord raised one arm. The Carrion infantry split gracefully, forming 2 massive lanes. Between them marched a smaller group, 20 soldiers carrying a massive object bound in chains of black iron. They set it down with ritualistic care. The warlord dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Then he approached the object and removed the chains. Gasps erupted from the battlements. Lysandros felt his stomach drop. It was a war drum, larger than any built by mortals, made of a metal that appeared to writhe with shadows. The warlord placed one gloved hand upon it. The drumbeat that followed was not a sound but an impact, felt in the bones, the chest, the teeth. The earth shuddered. Birds fled the sky. The sapphire walls flickered, their enchantments straining. Lysandros shouted, "Archers! Ready bows!" But his voice trembled, not from fear for himself, but for his city, his home, the Eternal Polis he had sworn to protect. As the second drumbeat thundered through the air, cracks spiderwebbed across the outermost wall. Soldiers gasped, stepping back in horror. The enchantment that had held for 5 centuries flickered again, the sapphire glow weakening. "Hold!" Lysandros roared, though even he felt despair creeping in. The warlord raised his hand for the third beat. Lysandros gritted his teeth. "If that drum strikes again," he whispered, "the wall will fall." The drumbeat fell. A deafening crack split the sky. The outer wall of the Eternal Polis, glorious, indestructible, divine, shattered like glass. And the siege had begun. The collapse of the outer wall sent a shockwave of terror through the Eternal Polis, a thunderous roar of stone and dust that drowned out screams as soldiers and citizens alike stumbled backward from the destruction, choking on shattered sapphire and disbelief. For generations they had believed the wall divine, a structure forged with sacred rites and protected by ancient enchantments, yet in a matter of heartbeats it lay in ruins, broken into glittering fragments that littered the ground like fallen stars. Lysandros stood amid the chaos, the force of the blast still ringing in his ears, the ground vibrating beneath his boots as the dust cloud rose like a storm giant's breath, rolling through the orchards and the fields where once children played. The carrion horde did not rush forward immediately. No cheers, no screams, no taunts, only that eerie, synchronized pause as though the entire army breathed together, drawing in the silence of a stunned city. Then the warlord raised his gauntlet hand, and the horde began to advance. Thousands of dark-armored soldiers marched through the breach with mechanical precision, their formation immaculate even as they stepped over the shattered sapphire stones. They carried curved blades etched with gold sigils that pulsed faintly like veins of fire, and their helmets bore slits that glowed a dim molten hue, giving them an inhuman, predatory gaze. The sight chilled Lysandros more than any mortal army ever had. These were not men, at least not anymore. They moved too perfectly, too silently, like puppets tied to the will of a single mind. The warlord rode behind them, unhurried, surveying the city like a butcher choosing where to carve first. Lysandros snapped back into motion, shouting orders to regroup along the ironwood barricades hastily erected behind the second wall. Already, horns blared throughout the polis, summoning all citizens to the interior districts. The once tranquil marble avenues now trembled with running footsteps. Priests of the Temple of Helios carried sacred relics to the central plaza for protection rituals. Scholars rushed to safeguard scrolls from the great library. Mothers, clutching children, sprinted toward the sanctuaries cut into the western cliffs. Lysandros shoved through panicked soldiers to reach the central stairway, calling out, "Hold formation! Shields up! Guardians to the front!" His skyward guardians formed a shining wall of gold steel shields, locking them into place with trained discipline, their wing-shaped helmets gleaming with defiance. Ajaxon, their commander, appeared at Lysandros' side, blood trickling from a cut above his brow, but his posture steady. "The breach is lost," he said grimly. "We must fall back to the Lion Gate." Lysandros nodded. "Signal the archers to fire at will. We buy time for the civilians to reach the citadel." Arrows rained from the battlements as archers unleashed volleys upon the advancing horde. Thousands of shafts sliced through the air like a black storm, yet when they struck the carrion soldiers, many simply deflected off their armor or snapped upon impact, as if hitting stone rather than flesh. Some arrows found small weaknesses, between plates or at joints, but even then the soldiers did not scream or falter. They simply continued marching, removing arrows from their bodies with slow, mechanical movements, discarding them like splinters. The archers trembled. Many had fought in wars before, but never had they seen enemies who did not bleed, did not cry out, did not die easily. A few soldiers broke rank and attempted to flee. Lysandros roared their names, dragging them back into formation, forcing them to remember what was at stake. "If we break now," he shouted, "the city falls. Stand firm." At the front line, the skyward guardians clashed with the horde. The impact was monstrous, steel against steel, shield against curved blade. Lysandros plunged into the fray with a fierce war cry, his spear sweeping in wide arcs as he fought with practiced precision. He parried a blade that hummed with an unnatural vibration, stabbed forward, and sent a carrion soldier sprawling. But instead of collapsing like a mortal man, the soldier shuddered once and began rising again. Lysandros cursed and severed its head with a second strike. Only then did the armored body lie still. "Aim for the neck or the joints," he called to his warriors. "They rise if you don't finish them." The battle devolved into a brutal grind. Bodies of guardians piled up with grim speed. The carrion forces pushed relentlessly, immune to fear or fatigue. The guardians fought valiantly, but they were men of flesh and blood, and each minute drained their strength. Lysandros could feel their resolve faltering like a candle flickering in a storm. Behind him, civilians continued fleeing through the Lion Gate, women crying, elders gasping for breath. He knew they were running out of time. A group of carrion soldiers broke through the guardian line, sprinting toward the escaping civilians. Lysandros pivoted, sprinting after them with desperate speed, his spear flashing. He intercepted the first soldier, sliding under its blade and slamming his weapon upward into its chest. It fell. Another charged him, raising its golden-sigiled blade. Lysandros blocked with his shield, sparks erupting. The force sent him stumbling backward. A young girl screamed. He forced himself forward again, cleaving through the soldier's legs before delivering a fatal strike. A Jackson appeared beside him, panting. "The line won't hold," he shouted over the din. "We need reinforcements, now." Lysandros's gaze snapped toward the citadel at the heart of the city, where 12 giant silver braziers lined the roof. "Then we light the Helios flame," he said. A Jackson's eyes widened. "We haven't used it in a century." "Better to die trying than let the polis fall," Lysandros answered. He pushed through the soldiers, sprinting toward the citadel as the battle raged behind him. Inside the citadel, a group of priests encircled the central brazier, chanting prayers as they attempted to ignite it. But the flames sputtered weakly, barely flickering. A priestess turned to Lysandros, sweat beading her forehead. "The warlord's presence dampens the divine fire. We cannot summon the full Helios flame." Lysandros ground his teeth. "Then I will." He approached the brazier, placed both hands on the marble rim, and bowed his head. He remembered the ancient rite taught to him by his mentor. The words tasted like fire on his tongue. "Helios, bearer of dawn, hear us. Light of kings, guide us. Flame of eternity, rise for your city." The flame twitched, growing brighter. Priests gasped. The brazier erupted with blinding golden fire that shot into the sky, igniting the other braziers in sequence until all 12 roared with divine brilliance. Outside, the effect was immediate. A beam of pure sunlight descended like a pillar, slamming into the battlefield. Several carrion soldiers were thrown backward, armor smoking. Others staggered, their movements slowing as if fighting against an unseen force. Lysandros seized the moment. "Guardians! Push forward!" he bellowed. Renewed energy surged through the defenders. Their blades glowed faintly under the golden light. They charged, driving the carrion forces back from the barricades. For a heartbeat, a single, glorious heartbeat, it seemed as if the Eternal Polis might hold. But then the warlord raised his hand. The golden light dimmed. A wave of darkness surged outward from him, consuming the sunlight in its path. The braziers flickered violently, their flames shrinking as if suffocated. The warlord stepped forward into the weakened light, his armor rippling like shadows dipped in molten gold. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unsheathed a massive blade forged of black metal streaked with glowing fissures. He raised it to the sky. The world held its breath. He brought the blade down. A shockwave of darkness exploded outward. The braziers went dead. The battlefield plunged into an unnatural twilight. The guardians were thrown to the ground, shields cracking. Lysandros was hurled 20 paces back, slamming into a column. Pain shot through him as he struggled to rise. The carrion soldiers surged forward once more, fueled by the warlord's overwhelming presence. Lysandros wiped blood from his mouth and forced himself to his feet. "Fall back," he yelled hoarsely. "Fall back to the inner wall." The guardians retreated in formation, dragging the wounded, covering civilians still escaping through the last safe passages. The carrion forces marched relentlessly behind them. As the defenders crossed the final bridge leading to the heart of the city, Lysandros looked back toward the ruined outer districts, the orchards burning, streets overrun with soldiers of shadow, homes collapsing under the advancing horde. The Eternal Polis, once a beacon of civilization, was becoming a battlefield of despair. But Lysandros was not done fighting. He would defend the inner wall. He would hold until the last breath. Because the Eternal Polis was not just a city. It was a promise. And he would not let that promise die. The retreat to the inner wall was a desperate, chaotic struggle against time, terror and exhaustion, with Lysandros at the front, shouting commands as his guardians staggered backward across the marble bridge that connected the ravaged outer districts to the heart of the Eternal Polis. Blood smeared the white stone, screams echoed from burning homes, and the distant rumble of collapsing towers rolled through the city like thunder. Behind them, the carrion horde pressed forward in perfect, merciless formation, their ranks absorbing arrow volleys and spear thrusts as if they were nothing but stray gusts of wind. Lysandros knew this bridge was the final choke point before the central district. If it fell, the horde would pour freely into the sanctuaries, the academies, the temples, and the great library itself, destroying the city's soul even before its body. "Cut the bridge supports!" Lysandros shouted, voice raw with urgency. Shocked guardians stared at him. A Jackson grabbed his arm. "Captain, our own people are still crossing." Lysandros looked over the panicked civilians sprinting across the bridge, women clutching babies, elderly men dragging grandchildren, priests gripping holy scrolls, and he clenched his jaw. 30 more seconds, he said, eyes sweeping the field behind them. The carrion infantry had nearly reached the bridgehead. Their glowing eyelets pierced through smoke and shadow. Their armor reflected the fires consuming the outer ring. And at the center of the advancing horde, the warlord strode atop his onyx stallion, unfazed by the chaos, his dark cape billowing behind him as though it longed to swallow the city whole. One final group of civilians stumbled across the bridge, shepherded by a pair of young guardians barely past adolescence, their armor dented, their faces streaked with soot and terror. Lysandros waited until the last child crossed, then gave the signal. Now! The guardians hacked through the bridge's golden support chains, and the marble span groaned, shuddered, and collapsed in a magnificent cascade of stone, dust, and water. The carrion vanguard tumbled into the ravine below, swallowed by the river's white foam. The warlord halted his army on the opposite side, staring across the chasm with chilling calm. Lysandros allowed himself a single breath of relief. The inner wall was still intact. For now. He turned to his men. Form ranks. Close the gates. Prepare for siege. The guards heaved the massive bronze gates shut with a booming clang that echoed through the entire district. Iron bars slid into place. A dozen mages from the Temple of Helios scrambled to reinforce the gates with sigils of protection, carving glowing runes into the metal as sweat dripped down their brows. The inner wall, far thicker, older, and more heavily enchanted than the outer ring, rose behind them, crowned with tall sapphire towers and massive ballistae. Yet Lysandros felt no comfort. The carrion horde was unlike any enemy in living memory. No wall, no matter how sturdy, could withstand them forever. Inside the inner district, the situation was spiraling. Citizens had crammed into the grand plazas, pushing against temple steps and library corridors. Some cried. Some prayed. Some argued in frantic whispers. The air smelled of burning orchards, panic, and fear sweat. Lysandros moved through the crowds, trying to calm them, but his words were drowned out by the thunderous sound that rolled across the chasm outside the walls. Boom, boom, boom. The war drum. The same unholy instrument that shattered the outer wall. And though the distance muted it, each beat still vibrated through the marble beneath their feet like an omen of destruction. At the council citadel, the archons were in disarray. Archon Seraphel paced like a trapped wolf, while others leaned over maps, shouting contradictory orders. Lysandros forced his way into the chamber. The outer ring is lost, he said bluntly. But the inner wall still stands. We need a coordinated defense, archers on every tower, guardians at all gates, fire oil ready, ballista bolts loaded. Seraphel snapped. And what of the civilians? Tens of thousands crowd the plazas. Move them to the western caverns, Lysandros replied. The tunnels carved into the cliffs. If the walls fall, That is their only refuge. Thales nodded gravely. And the council? Lysandros met his gaze. You stay here. If the city loses its leadership, we fall faster. Another rumble. The war drum beat again. Dust shook from the ceiling. A messenger burst into the chamber. Captain, the carrion, they're building something outside the chasm. Lysandros rushed to the upper balcony, overlooking the breach, and what he saw turned his blood cold. The horde had begun constructing a massive siege engine, larger than anything he'd ever seen, using black iron beams carried by 10 soldiers each. It looked like a monstrous tower, its frame growing rapidly as hundreds of carrion infantry worked in perfect unison, assembling it at frightening speed. Sigil-branded priests of the horde chanted around its base, weaving dark energy into the structure, strengthening it with enchantments unfamiliar to human eyes. They intend to cross the chasm, a Jackson whispered beside him. They'll bring the tower across and breach the inner wall. Lysandros nodded grimly. Then we cannot let it reach completion. Within minutes, guardians loaded the ballistae with enormous flaming bolts, setting the tips ablaze with sacred oils. Lysandros raised his arm. Aim for the tower's base. Fire. The ballistae released a thunderous volley, streaking across the chasm like comets. But the carrion responded instantly. Several soldiers raised their golden sigiled shields, forming a barrier that glowed with dark energy. The bolts struck the barrier, and vanished, snuffed out like sparks against night. The guardians stared in disbelief. Lysandros felt rage flare within him. Load again. Higher angle. Aim for the priests. But before the next volley launched, the warlord raised his sword and slashed the air. A wave of black gold energy erupted from the blade, sweeping across the chasm and slamming into the inner wall like a hurricane. The battlements trembled. Archers fell. A tower cracked, fragments tumbling into the abyss. Lysandros shielded his face as stone chips sliced the air. The warlord's power was overwhelming, far beyond what any mortal, or even any sorcerer, should wield. Lysandros knew the truth he had feared since dawn. This was not a war of armies. This was a war of power. Ancient power. Forbidden power. We need the Helios flame again, he muttered. A Jackson shook his head. But the warlord suppressed it. Then we find a way to ignite it stronger than he can extinguish it. As they climbed down from the battlements, the ground shook violently. A guardian shouted from above. Captain! They're coming! Lysandros turned, and his heart dropped. The siege tower was finished. It stood taller than the inner wall, braced with spiked legs, covered in dark iron plating. And it moved. The horde pushed it forward with impossible speed, sliding it across thick wooden rollers as though it weighed nothing. Priests chanted. Sigils glowed. The tower accelerated, rolling straight toward the chasm. They cannot cross. A Jackson began, but his words died as the tower emitted a deafening roar. A massive bridge of black metal unfolded from its front, extending like a monstrous tongue. The chasm shook. The bridge slammed down, spanning the gap perfectly. The route into the inner city was open. Archers! Lysandros shouted. Guardians! Shields up! But the carrion soldiers were already charging across the bridge, their steps synchronized, silent and terrifying. The guardians met them with a resounding clash of steel, sparks flying as the two forces collided. Lysandros plunged into the battle, slashing at a soldier's neck, sending its head rolling. A Jackson blocked a swing aimed at a priest behind them. Archers fired from the walls, but many arrows bounced harmlessly off the carrion armor. The battle consumed the bridge. Lysandros fought with desperation, his spear slicing through armored joints. A carrion soldier tackled him, pinning him to the ground. He grabbed a fallen dagger, slammed it into the creature's throat joint, and rolled free just in time to avoid another curved blade. He rose, panting, and saw a Jackson fighting 3 soldiers at once. A guardian fell beside them, throat slashed. More carrion poured across the bridge. We can't hold them. A Jackson shouted. Lysandros wiped blood from his brow. Then we break the bridge. He sprinted toward the base of the nearest wall tower. Bring fire oil. Torches. Guardians scrambled, hauling barrels of thick oil toward the bridge's support points. Carrion soldiers turned toward them, but Lysandros and Ajaxon held them off as best as they could. Pour it. Lysandros commanded. The barrels were tipped. Flames erupted. The bridge shuddered. But the dark priests chanted louder. The flames bent backward, defying nature, snuffing out in midair. Lysandros froze. The carrion had protected the bridge. Ajaxon whispered, horrified, "There's no breaking it." The battle raged. The guardians held the line, but barely. Lysandros felt exhaustion creeping like poison through his limbs. The carrion numbers swelled. Their shadows lengthened. Then, out of the smoke, a figure stepped onto the bridge. The warlord. Towering, cloaked in living armor that rippled like molten night, his eyes burning with gold-lit darkness. Lysandros felt the world shrink around him. The warlord lifted his massive blade. The air trembled. And Lysandros knew. The wall would fall. The city would break. And the true siege was only beginning. The warlord's presence on the bridge changed the very air of the battlefield, turning it thick and suffocating, as if the city itself were mourning its impending doom. His massive armor pulsed with veins of molten gold, the sigils carved into the breastplate shifting like living serpents, and every step he took sent a tremor across the marble beneath him. Lysandros felt the tremble through his boots as he stood among broken shields, fallen guardians, and curling smoke from failed fire oil attempts. For the first time in years, fear, real fear, wrapped its fingers around his spine. The guardians nearest him faltered, their disciplined ranks wavering like candle flames in a storm. Even Ajaxon, unwavering commander of the skyward guardians, had to grip his spear tightly to hide the tremor in his fingers. The warlord raised his blade, and a wave of darkness swept outward, dimming every torch, every enchanted lantern, even the sacred glyphs carved into the inner wall towers. The Eternal Polis, city of light, suddenly felt swallowed by an eclipse. "Hold the line," Lysandros shouted, though his voice strained against the suffocating energy pressing inward from the warlord. The carrion soldiers surged behind their leader in perfect synchronization, their curved blades sweeping like mechanical scythes, their shadows stretched unnaturally across the bridge as they advanced. Guardians fell beneath the onslaught, some sliced cleanly through their armor, others knocked from the bridge into the ravine below. The air resonated with the clash of steel, screams, and the deep hum of dark enchantment radiating from the warlord. The first blow the warlord delivered was not with his sword. It was a shockwave of pure force released from a downward stomp that cracked the marble bridge beneath him, sending fissures racing toward the defenders. Guardians were thrown off their feet. Lysandros was hurled backward, slamming into the inner wall so hard he saw stars. Blood trickled down his temple. He forced himself upright just as Ajaxon blocked a killing strike aimed at him. "Get up, Captain!" Ajaxon roared. "They're breaking through." The defenders fell back toward the bronze gates, forming a desperate half-circle around Lysandros, struggling to maintain any semblance of formation. The carrion pressed harder. 3 guardians attempted to flank the warlord, thrusting their spears simultaneously at his ribs, but the warlord merely shifted his stance. His blade blurred in a single arc that cut all 3 down in one sweeping motion. Their bodies fell in perfect unison, blood pooling together across the cracked bridge. Gasps rippled through the defenders. All hope seemed to wither in the shadow of that one brutal strike. Still, Lysandros pushed forward, fueled not by confidence but by refusal. Refusal to yield, refusal to let the city of his ancestors fall without every drop of his blood spilled first. He lunged at the warlord with a vicious, upward thrust. Their blades clashed. The impact jolted Lysandros's arm to the shoulder. The warlord barely reacted, only tilting his head as though studying an insect. Then he shoved Lysandros back with contemptuous ease. Lysandros skidded across the stone, boots scraping sparks. He barely regained footing before the warlord's next strike came, a downward blow that would have split him from shoulder to hip if Ajaxon hadn't intercepted at the last moment. The clash sent Ajaxon flying, smashing him into a ballista tower. He slid down the wall, coughing blood. "A Jackson!" Lysandros cried, but the warlord's blade drove between them, blocking his path. The Carian soldiers flooded the bridge behind their master, pushing the defenders into the plaza. The archons watched from the citadel balcony, pale with terror, their voices lost beneath the noise. The priests attempted to reignite the Helios flame, drawing glyphs in the air and chanting frantic prayers, but the flame sputtered uselessly, its divine glow smothered under the warlord's oppressive aura. "Lysandros!" a voice screamed from the plaza. It was Thales, the silver-haired archon, leaning over the balcony railing. "You must withdraw. The inner district is lost. Fall back to the caverns." But Lysandros shook his head violently. "If we fall back now, they'll slaughter the civilians before they reach safety." He turned just in time to parry another strike from a Carian soldier. The clash numbed his arm. Sweat dripped from his brow. His muscles trembled. He couldn't keep this up forever. None of them could. At that moment, a thunderous boom echoed across the city, not from the war drum, not from the walls, but from the sky itself. Clouds churned overhead in spirals of gold and red. A column of sunlight pierced through the darkness, striking the central plaza like a spear. The ground glowed. The air crackled. Everyone, Carian and Guardian alike, froze. The warlord paused mid-step, golden eyes narrowing. Lysandros shielded his eyes as the radiance intensified. Then a voice, ancient and booming, filled the plaza. "Children of the Eternal Polis, your flame is not yet extinguished." A figure descended within the column of light, an apparition of Helios himself, or perhaps a divine envoy. His form was luminous, shifting, difficult to gaze upon directly. His voice resonated deep in the bones. "The warlord bears a corrupted power older even than your city," the entity said. "A shadow forged in betrayal. But the sun's fire yet answers those who refuse the night." The entity extended his glowing hand toward Lysandros. "Take it." Lysandros hesitated only a heartbeat. He reached forward, and the moment his fingers touched the radiance, agony seared through his veins. His body arched backward. Light erupted from his chest. His spear burst into white flame. Guardians cried out in awe. Carian soldiers recoiled. Even the warlord took a guarded step back. Lysandros gasped, struggling to breathe beneath the torrent of divine fire now coursing through him. His skin glowed. His eyes blazed gold. His voice, when he spoke, was layered with the entity's own resonance. "I will not let my city fall." The column of light faded, but the fire within Lysandros remained. He lowered his spear. It hummed like a living thing. When he stepped forward, each footfall left a brief trail of golden embers. "Guardians!" Lysandros shouted, his voice echoing across the plaza. "The sun stands with us. Form ranks." The skyward guardians rallied behind him, reinvigorated by the divine spectacle. The archons gawked. Priests dropped to their knees. The warlord lifted his massive sword, assessing this new threat. For the first time, he spoke, his voice deep, layered with malice. "Solar flame will not save you, mortal." Lysandros leveled his spear at him. "We will see." Then he charged. The clash was cataclysmic, light against shadow, divine radiance against corrupted might. The warlord's blade slammed into Lysandros's spear, sending a shockwave through the plaza. Golden and black sparks erupted, lighting the plaza like storm-lit night. The guardians joined the battle with renewed ferocity, their weapons glowing faintly under Lysandros's aura. The Carian soldiers faltered for the first time, stepping back beneath the force of the defenders' assault. But the warlord was not weakened. His armor rippled with darkness, absorbing the divine flames flung against him. He struck with terrifying power. Lysandros blocked one blow that shattered the marble beneath his feet. Another sent him sliding across the plaza. The two forces collided again and again, neither yielding. Yet for all the divine power surging through Lysandros, the warlord remained unbroken, a titan of shadow. Still, Lysandros refused to retreat. Even as his vision blurred, Even as his limbs trembled and fire scorched him from the inside, he stood firm. "You will not have my city," he roared, lunging with a final radiant strike that split the air. The warlord caught the spear with one hand and smiled. Lysandros felt his stomach drop. The warlord whispered, "Light can be extinguished." Then darkness exploded outward. The world went silent. And Lysandros fell. The world returned to Lysandros in fragments. First the taste of iron in his mouth, then the distant roar of battle, then the blurred sight of a sky darkened by smoke and swirling clouds. But when he tried to rise, agony burned through his ribs, and he realized with horror that he lay on the shattered marble of the central plaza, moments, or minutes, after the warlord's catastrophic blast had struck him. The divine fire that had filled him was now a faint ember flickering weakly in his chest, struggling against the suffocating shadow pressing down on the city. Around him, guardians fought in desperation, their once tight formations now broken lines of exhausted warriors trying to protect civilians pouring toward the western caverns. Ajaxon knelt beside Lysandros, bleeding heavily from a deep slash across his shoulder, shaking him violently. "Captain! Captain, get up! The warlord is breaking through the last ranks." Lysandros tried, but his limbs trembled uncontrollably. The golden glow in his veins flickered like a dying candle. He looked past Ajaxon and saw the warlord advancing across the plaza, each step an earthquake, each motion radiating a twisted power that seemed to throttle the very air. The monstrous siege tower behind him had moved closer, its iron frame blotting out the horizon, and carrion soldiers poured from it like ants from a nest, overwhelming every guardian, every archer, every defender they encountered. The inner wall was nearly empty of defenders, its battlements ruled by shadows. Flames raged across the lower districts. Screams echoed through the alleys. The Eternal Polis, beautiful, ancient, revered, was dying. But Lysandros refused to watch it collapse. He forced himself onto his knees, fingers clawing at the broken marble, summoning every remaining spark of the divine fire within him. Pain exploded through his spine. Blood dripped into his eyes. Ajaxon grabbed his arm. "You're dying," he said through clenched teeth. "You must retreat to the caverns. We can still save the survivors." Lysandros cut him off, voice trembling. "No, if the warlord reaches the caverns, no one survives." Ajaxon's jaw tightened, grief etching new lines across his ash-covered face. "Then what do we do?" Lysandros looked at the sun glyph etched into the plaza floor, cracked but still faintly glowing beneath soot and rubble. "We ignite the Helios flame, not in the braziers, but here." Ajaxon stared at him as if he'd gone mad. "Lysandros, you can't channel that fire again. It nearly killed you." Lysandros took a shuddering breath. "If I don't, everyone dies." He placed both bloody palms on the glyph. The marble hummed faintly beneath him, as though recognizing his touch. The divine spark inside him flared weakly, struggling to rise. He felt as if he were trying to lift a mountain with shattered bones. The warlord was now only a dozen paces away. Guardians flung themselves at him, but he swatted them aside effortlessly, their bodies crashing into surrounding pillars. His voice thundered, distorted and ancient. "The Eternal Polis falls today. The age of light is over. The world bows to shadow." His blade lifted. It pulsed dark gold. And it swung down toward Lysandros. Ajaxon screamed. Lysandros focused every ounce of will, every memory of the city he loved, the festivals beneath lantern-strung streets, the libraries overflowing with scrolls, the laughter of children watching guardians train, the pride of standing atop the sapphire walls at sunrise, and he poured it into the dying ember inside him. The glyph blazed with sudden blinding brilliance. A spear of sunlight erupted upward, catching the warlord's blade mid-descent. The impact shook the entire plaza. The warlord recoiled, armor smoking where the light had touched it. His molten gold eyes narrowed in rage. Lysandros screamed, not in fear but in the agony of channeling a divine force mortals were never meant to wield twice. The light burst from his chest, traveling down his arms, into the glyph, and outward into the plaza, searing bright enough to turn shadows to vapor. The Carian soldiers shrieked for the first time, an unearthly metallic sound, as the pure sunlight washed over them. Their armor cracked. Their bodies smoldered. Dozens collapsed into heaps of blackened metal. The siege tower shuddered, its enchantments failing, dark sigils flickering like dying embers. For a moment, one miraculous, impossible moment, the Eternal Polis shone again, radiant beneath a sky split by divine fire. But the warlord did not fall. He roared, a sound like a collapsing mountain, and plunged his blade into the ground. A surge of black energy exploded outward, colliding with Lysandros's radiance in a cataclysmic clash of power. The plaza cracked open. Columns toppled. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Light and darkness wrestled in the air, twisting, writhing, tearing at the sky. Lysandros felt his chest burning, melting, divine fire eating him alive. The warlord stumbled, his armor blistering, cracks spreading across his helm. He was weakening, finally weakening, but so was Lysandros. Ajaxon crawled toward him, screaming his name, but the shockwaves flung him back again and again. Guardians shielded their eyes, unable to approach. Civilians watching from the cavern entrance fell to their knees, unable to comprehend the spectacle unfolding before them. Lysandros's vision dimmed. His body trembled violently. His bones felt hollow. The warlord's voice echoed across the chaos. "You cannot kill me, mortal. I am shadow incarnate." Lysandros coughed blood, but he forced out the words, "I don't need to kill you." His hands pressed deeper into the burning glyph. "I only need to stop you." Then, with the last remnants of his strength, he released everything. Every ember, every spark, every drop of divine fire coursing through him. The light detonated. A sunburst consumed the plaza, engulfing Lysandros and the warlord alike. The shockwave swept through the city, vaporizing Carian soldiers, shattering the siege tower, and blasting the horde back across the destroyed bridge. The sky turned white, then gold, then slowly faded. When the radiance dimmed, the plaza was silent. Completely silent. Soot drifted like black snow. The ground was scorched glass. The glyph at the center lay cracked and glowing faintly. And at its heart lay Lysandros, unmoving, his armor melted into the marble, his body still. The warlord was gone. Vanished. Broken. Scattered to the winds. Ajaxon stumbled to Lysandros's side, falling to his knees with a strangled cry. Guardians gathered around him in tearful silence. The archons emerged from the citadel, faces pale with grief and awe. The priests bowed deeply. Civilians, men, women, children, approached slowly, reverently, forming a circle around the fallen captain. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Thales whispered, voice trembling. "He has become what the ancients called the sunbound. A mortal who gave his soul to the flame." Ajaxon bowed his head over Lysandros's still hand. "He saved us all," he said, voice breaking. "The Eternal Polis stands because of him." And as the surviving citizens lifted their faces toward the dawn, a gentle beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, warm, pure, impossibly soft, falling upon Lysandros one last time, as if Helios himself had bowed in respect. The Eternal Polis lived. The Carian horde had been driven back. The warlord had been destroyed. But the cost. The cost was carved forever into marble, memory, and legend. For the city would never forget the man who burned brighter than the sun to save it. The man who became the light that the shadow could not kill.